Hello and welcome to our special show Masterclass with me Priyanka Chawla. Now India is steadily working to become a pool of market-ready talent for the world at large and not just for domestic needs. With India having the world's largest youth population, that is 64% of 1.3 billion in the working age group, developing an efficient skill force is a must. It should hold top priority in a developing country like ours as the skilled workforce drives the economy. That's exactly what is our topic of discussion for today's masterclass. Whose responsibility should be creating skilled workforce? Government, education institutes or the students? Let me welcome our esteemed panel of guests for today's discussion. Professor Suku Bhaskaran, he is the president of GD Goenka University. Mr. Charit Jaggi, he is the founder of We the Young, a new age media platform helping youngsters to develop creative skills. And Mr. Supreeth Nagaraju, Head Education of Adobe Systems, India and Southeast Asia. My first question to you, Mr. Jaggi, how do you think India is doing at the level of creating the skilled workforce, which is going to be much needed thing in the post-COVID-19 world as well?
Thank you for having me on the show. And I'd like to say that there's a huge disconnect when it comes to the skills that are needed for the 21st century, which is also what the UNICEF report points out, and between what is actually happening on the ground. We've seen that largely soft skills remain something that a lot of young people do not have access to or are trying to get access to but do not have enough mentorship to get to it. So definitely there's a huge lack over there, as well as the traditional education system that you and I and all of us have been a part of has not made us ready for the 21st century jobs. Teaching in educational institutions in a lot of places, and specifically across Tier 2 and Tier 3 India, still continues to happen in a very still has a colonial hangover to it, or is not as up to date or up to speed with the modern skill set. So I do feel that there's a definite gap over there, and yeah, I think there's a huge need and potential to address it.
Absolutely. Let's go over to Mr. Suku Bhaskaran. Sir, do you think India has been, able to create the skilled workforce? As he rightly pointed out, the traditional education we all have been, pursuing in our school life and college life, does it help to create those kind of skills which makes us stand apart when we are, going to get jobs in the market? What do you think? How do you think you would rate India in creating the skilled workforce from the traditional education system which we have in the country?
Very good afternoon. Thank you for having me over on this show. First things first, I think we've done a good job in moving from being a traditional formal system of education where we have the university systems, and now we are focusing over the last at least couple of years where skill and vocational education has become a center of development in many of the educational institutions, both formal as well as the non-formal system. Now, there are pluses and minuses in this current focus area where we've focused traditionally in the skilling as an area primarily to do with the elementary skills. But yes, are we really geared up in terms of blending this model to people or the future workforce who've not been able to be part of the education system at all? There are millions of students who probably after college or the school dropouts who have not been able to attend the college, or even for that matter attend ITIs or diplomas for that matter. Many of them can't even afford for things, primarily owing to time constraints and family backgrounds. So have we able to raise up to those marks is a question that we need to address.
Absolutely. Mr. Bhaskaran, would you like to add to what the other guests have been pointing out, the India's rating India in terms of creating skilled workforce?
First of all, thank you for having me on the show.
Our pleasure, sir.
Let me first say what my beliefs are. I do not believe there is a basis of rating India vis-a-vis other countries. What has been the outcome is what would inform us. So, for example, we have a high rate of unemployment among engineers in India. There are far too many engineering colleges, and people are not, the standards are sometimes questionable, and they are not being able to get jobs. Therefore, there must be a rethink of what are the skill sets that are required, number one, and what one of the panel members said in terms of vocational skills. Yes, it is very important. And therefore, not everybody should be put into the channel of going for higher education. The requirement in the higher education is quite different than from what is needed in vocational education. Therefore, I believe we must have much stronger drive in regard to vocational education.
Right.
And that can even be delivered to universities in some cases, such as there are subjects such as nursing. And if you go abroad, you see a lot of Indian nurses working in the US, Philadelphia. When I went there, I was really shocked to see the number of Indian nurses. There are Indian nurses in Middle Eastern countries. There are lots of nursing is a very achievable vocation, even through the higher education route. But there are other skill sets as well, such as the need for mechanic, the need for electrician, the need for bakers, the need for chefs, etc. So there is a need for many other skills. And what I've observed in India, by the way, I'm a 10, 11-year-old Indian. My ancestry is from India, but I've come back to India late in my life, for 11 years. What I have observed is that vocational education is not a preferred choice in India. And I was surprised. Whereas in countries like Australia, you've got polytechnics that encourage and develop their skills in a variety of education. And that is a preferred option for many students there. Therefore, yes, India needs a trained workforce, and yes, it needs a healthy workforce. And these can be achieved only through a cohesive action by the government, by higher education providers, by vocational education providers, by the community. In other words, there has got to be a very integrated approach to this rather than a piecemeal approach.
Absolutely, absolutely. That brings me to my next question to Mr. Supreeth. What do you think is the role of the different stakeholders involved here? The government, the universities, education faculties, and of course the student, and how can they contribute to the skilled workforce movement, which has also been started by PM Modi back in 2015?
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize on two very important points. One is the fact that learning is not a spectator sport, and second, need is the mother of all gods, right? And I think from a stakeholder standpoint here, the need starts from the fact that the hunger factor in the students, primary need starts from the students who are keen on going and identifying what they are good at, and then demanding the creators, that's the educational institutions, to offer specific programs that are in line with the industry. That's the first aspect of it. You just cannot be blindsided and just go around and say that I'll pick up whatever comes along the way. That's number one. Number two is the fact that there is a need for a very strong collaborative approach in terms of identifying what are the skills that are in demand from the current landscape, both globally impacting India and also from an internal India standpoint, and then align your overall approach in terms of offering programs which could be short-term, medium-term, long-term, or across the landscape of the education fraternity, both in terms of vocational as well as formal, or it could be a combination of offering vocational blended in a credited model with the university system. Number three, government and the policymakers role become very, very critical, because the largest educational institutions in the country are primarily owned by state-owned or the central government-owned in nature, and also with respect to various forms of non-formal education system in place. There is a necessity for government to look at offering these across the educational system, which is owned by the government, not just in line with what is being traditional, but to have a very clear synchronization with the industry at large. So all three play a crucial role, but starts with students at large, and need for demand starts from there.
Absolutely, it starts from the students. Mr. Jaggi, your opinion, which stakeholder has the highest responsibility? Mr. Supreeth feels that he starts from the students. Your opinion on it?
Well, absolutely. I think there has to be a collaboration between all stakeholders, without which the entire engine cannot function. And having said that, I think although entrepreneurship is something that is getting a huge boost by the government, but it's still not enough. We need to do more on that front, and that's something that can make the workforce and India traditionally, if you look at it, the middle class has been a class of people who looks at jobs as the only aspiration. It's almost as if in middle class families like mine, going and doing a business is discouraged because a job is more secure. And I think we can at best conclude and sort of reduce the fact that at this point in time, nothing is certain. No job is fixed, be it in any sector whatsoever, which is why there is a need for an alternative approach. And I feel entrepreneurship sort of gives a huge hope to a lot of people. And if the support comes from the government, from parents, from kids themselves, then I think that that's something that could be a very, very conclusive effort in the direction of skilling young people.
Absolutely, everybody has to come together for it. Professor Bhaskaran, my question is to you. You come from a very leading university in India. How do you think your own university has involved in terms of, imparting soft skills, encouraging students to go for entrepreneurship rather than the traditional, job users and not being job creators themselves?
We've got a separate skills sector that trains people for skills. That's a separate operation for the higher education. Now, in a higher education, as everywhere in the world, I think the process is to develop people's skills in higher order thinking and higher order work, etc. For that, yes, if soft skills are needed, they are always part of the curriculum in terms of you develop those skills during class presentations, you develop those skills through group engagements, learning how to work with diverse groups of people. So those skill sets that are required are implanted in the traditional courses. Even a course like medical and allied science, we will still have group discussions, we will have class presentations, we will have group projects. Therefore, that learning happens. But even more important than that, we were going to an earlier question of whose responsibility it is. It's the responsibility of all stakeholders, because the other thing that has got to be remembered is that the jobs of the future could be quite different, vastly different to jobs that are available today.
Right.
As the industrial landscape is changing, these things also change. The type of jobs that will become available will also change. So we can't push this responsibility onto young minds such as the students. There is a responsibility among all of us. The institutions, both government and private sector institutions, the community, the government, everyone to explore, find out, and what would be the kind of skills that we require in the next 3, 4, 5 years' time. Because you do not want a situation where students go on and pursue something in short term, as a short-term interest, only to realize that there are no vocations there. So if you take the case of engineering, which I already cited, there are many unemployed engineers. If you look at architecture, for example, the seats are not getting filled in many of the Indian institutions, including the premier institutions. So there is a big gap between the skill sets that are required and what training we are providing. Number one. Number two, in terms of educating students now and students of the future, that the employment landscape would change quite considerably, and preparing them for that. For them to understand that skilled jobs can be highly paying jobs.
Right.
And that there is a reticence among our people to sort of go on to skilled jobs. And that is a big shame, actually. If you look at countries like China, only about 10-15% of the people who finish their 10 and year 12 go on for higher education. The vast majority go into vocational education. That's definitely the case in a country like Australia, where I've spent my entire life. That's definitely the case in England, where I've spent a lot of time. And therefore, if you look at a developing country setting as in China, or in a developed country setting, you would easily recognize that the thrust of moving forward has been initiated by the government, yes, but also through engagement with the universities, polytechnics, uh, and other institutions that provide education and training. And we've got to
Absolutely.
distinguish what is education, what is training. And the role of universities should be to provide a high quality training. You get people who are able to think outside the box, who have got analytical skills, who have got critical thinking skills, and therefore the quality of our scientists, our engineers, our lawyers need to be laddered up. While there should also be great opportunities for people into going skilled workforce way.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's go over to Mr. Supreeth. If I were to ask you, if you were an education administrator or the head of an educational department at some state government level, what would your top 3 actions would be to encourage that?
Okay. First things first would be the fact that we need to move out of the status quo, which means that there is a necessity for flipping what we currently do. Traditionally, at least during my educational times, and I think even currently, there is a heavy emphasis on theoretical aspect to the extent of about 80-85% in most of the educational institutions across different strata, whether it is polytechnics, ITIs, or even for that matter universities, which are both public and private. I think there is a necessity for you to flip the model to 80% practical and 20% theoretical. That's the first aspect of it. Second important aspect of it would be to make a mandatorily, maybe about 100 hours of a specific cross-functional skill. Let's say, for example, an electrical engineering, student looking at having something on technical writing as an area, or a student from civil looking at an AR/VR as a skill, or it could be somebody from an architectural background looking at UI/UX as an area. I'm just giving an example. So,
Right.
or it could be even a student looking at digital forensics as a skill. So there are various permutation combinations that you need to look at, because today traditional walls are breaking. Corporates are no longer looking at university degrees as the only medium or a minimum eligibility to look at hiring the workforce, and the overall landscape of hiring is changing very drastically. The second most important piece is, I think there is a need for institutions to look at research-based, engagement models, and ensuring that university professors look at having equal weightage to research jointly with students as an area. These are very two broad areas that I like to look at. The third last important point is on emphasis on entrepreneurship. I think one of the co-panelists just mentioned about it, and there's a need for mandating a certain percentage of students to have a particular number of hours that they do internship or create their own entrepreneurial stints within the university or near the ecosystem in and around their respective geographies.
Absolutely. Mr. Jaggi, do you agree with what the points Mr. Supreeth laid out? He also stresses on the fact that entrepreneurship is going to be one big option for students coming out and in the job market.
Well, absolutely, 100%. And also, in addition to that, I feel that as someone who closely works, and I have sort of interviewed close to 800 applicants in the last 2 years, met a lot of young people. And what I've realized is that there's a segmentation. There's a top tier college and top tier school where the internships are provided, and where practical learning experience is emphasized upon. But largely in a lot of schools that are not the top-notch schools typically, both colleges and schools, there is very limited focus, perhaps because of the lack of resources. All right, so what I was emphasizing on, that largely top schools and top colleges are places which emphasize on the need for practical internships, but there is still a larger segment of schools, institutions, where these things are not compulsorily done. And I feel as entrepreneurs, as thought leaders, as mentors and guides and leaders of institutions and heads of organizations, it is upon us also to take up the mantle of having more resources, having more interns be around us for a couple of their summer vacation breaks, etc., to actually get practically exposed to stuff and see how it works in the industry, which I've always seen such a significant shift in people who have interned in places versus those who haven't. And these could be soft skills as well. Something as simple as writing a subject line, or how to build your own resume, or what are the kind of applications that will get you a response from the employer. These are things that only happen once you're exposed practically to situations, to work environments, which is why I feel that in addition to what my co-panelists mentioned, a focus on internships should be something that we should strongly look at.
Absolutely. Internship is also a very good point. Mr. Bhaskaran, I would like to ask you as well, how different is the perceived role of Indian universities as compared to foreign universities, in producing job-ready graduates?
Abroad, particularly in, say, Australia, UK, and the US, the universities do not take upon the role of placing people. You train, you educate people, students, and they look out for jobs and they find jobs. Perhaps that model will not be applicable in India, because we have got a long history of students giving primacy to placements, and therefore it's a totally different environment. And number two, the number of people looking for jobs are also far greater than in those countries. The second point you need to remember is, as I said earlier, that getting people job ready can be quite not so straightforward, because the jobs of tomorrow could be different from the jobs of today. Even over a short-term period, over a 3-year degree program, what is in demand today may not be in demand 3 years later. So that's a situation we got to think about. Number two, India is not the only workplace that our students aspire to go. Today it's a global market. As I gave the example of the nursing or even a computer science graduate. Yeah, Indians are traveling all over the world because the demand is greater there. It looks like it. And also there is in terms of the universities itself, resource requirements are very demanding, both in the private sector and in government universities. It is a big ask for us to compete with foreign universities when their resource availability is greater in terms of physical infrastructure for science and technology, in terms of being able to recruit expensive professors from around the world, etc. So the first thing I believe that we need to do is reduce this high emphasis on higher education, and that higher education should be world-class.
Okay.
Which at the moment it is not, unfortunately. It should be world-class. Our best universities do not feature in the world rankings of universities such as QS and Times Higher Education, and Shanghai Jiotong rankings. We don't feature because resources are being dissipated. In a country with shortage of resources, I think we should limit those resources and provide truly very high quality education.
Absolutely.
And the rest to different levels of education.
Absolutely. Mr. Bhaskaran, we have just few minutes to go. So my last question is to Mr. Supreeth. You have been a business leader, driving transformation with many technologies and MNCs and academic institutes as well. Can you share us the importance of digital learning and technology trends that we need to watch out and implement as well in the country?
Okay. Pretty broad question though. Let me try to do justice to it.
Yes, please do.
First things first is the fact that I think there is a need for democratization of the overall engagement model. Today, you just cannot confine students to a specific classroom and say, hey, you need to clock in X number of hours, and here is your assignments and specifics of evaluation through a written examination, and then here you go, here's your degree. I think there is a need for relooking at that from an engagement standpoint, because all fingers are of not the same size and shape. And we have a huge problem in the industry with respect to meeting certain, skill gaps and demands. And just to give you some figures from a digital industry alone, there are close to about 200,000 plus open positions where students of 0 to 2 years experience bracket are not even qualified to sit for interviews. So first things first is the fact that, you need to look at digital engagement so that, students can learn, engage, social education becomes a very, very critical component, so that they learn from their peers. That's the first important aspect. The second important aspect is to do with faculties moving to the online platform, and I think there is a little bit of rigidity in our Indian professors, where they're not keen on giving up what they have as knowledge to the outside world, unless and until you market yourself as a guru. I don't think students really are willing to accept, because today they have google.com as one of the biggest repository where they want to go and verify that, and it's a statement of truth, right? Let's accept that. I'm not saying that you don't want to let go, but I think there is a necessity for you to democratize it even more further and showcase what you can. Third most important point is the fact that flexibility in terms of choosing and swapping what people like to do. Some people are good at readers of text, some people are good at audio, video, and then there are people who are just extremely good at maths. And I think it's important for universities to and the entire educational ecosystem to look at increasing the overall plethora of options that are available to students.
Thank you, Mr. Supreeth. We are running short of time. I'll have to cut you short there. But thank you, gentlemen. I think all the stakeholders must have gathered some really interesting information about how everyone is equally responsible for creating skilled workforce out of India. Thank you so much for being a part of Masterclass. Time to wrap up the show. News and updates continue on India Ahead.